Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap podcast. I'm Evan Neufeld and thanks for joining me. Today's topic is emergency funds. We'll cover why you should consider having an emergency fund. Is it even necessary? And if so, how much should you have saved? Finally, we'll cover any potential downsides to having an emergency fund. So why do you need an emergency fund? Well, right now, during the COVID-19 epidemic, it's been pretty clear to some people that emergencies come in all shapes and sizes. Right now, many people are dealing with loss of job or decrease in work, which means a decrease in income. And so an emergency in this case involves being able to pay your bills, buy groceries, put gas in the car, things like that. But sometimes there's other emergencies, and they can be very expensive. Even being diagnosed with an illness, your pet running into a porcupine, you name it. In my case, the one time that I needed an emergency fund, I was getting some work done on my car. Picture it with me here. It's a 1993 Toyota Camry V6 5-speed. This thing was a hot car. Not so much actually, but I was getting a new radiator put into it. And I went to the shop to pay for the new radiator. And when I went back out to the car to drive away, I saw that the entire left side, the driver's side of the vehicle was completely smashed. And so obviously I didn't drop it off in that condition. So I went back in to the shop and I did some investigation and we realized that there was a hit and run done overnight while the car was parked there. So at the time, I had just come back from a missions trip to Thailand and I was just starting working. And so I didn't have any cash on hand. But because it was a hit and run, I needed to go through the police and my processing for my insurance claim would take a little bit of extra time. So for me to get a car, I needed to enlist the help of my parents because I didn't have any cash on hand for a down payment on a new vehicle or even any cash on hand to buy a cheap used car in the meantime. So that was a situation that I didn't foresee coming. I had enough cash on hand to pay for the emergency of the new radiator, but I didn't have enough to pay for the expense of a new car potentially. So that's just one example that I've seen in my life, but there's any number of emergencies that happen, and to think about every option that there is out there for emergencies is really difficult because an emergency is something that is unforeseen and typically unplanned for. So what happens if you don't have one? Well, in my case, I had to get a line of credit for that new car. But many people, if you've been an investor, you might have to redeem from what you thought was going to be your long-term savings. And especially during a global pandemic like we're in right now, the markets have been really volatile. And so you may be forced to redeem from investments which have decreased in value. And thus you're compounding the problem by forcing yourself to sell at a bad time. A second option is to use a credit card or a line of credit. And what's really happening in that case is you're compounding the problem. So you have an emergency that requires money. An emergency is typically a big problem in your life. Now you have a financial problem that's an ongoing. So you can solve the problem, but now you have a financial problem going forward with added debt that you need to pay back somehow. Sometimes that's doable, and in my case it was because I was just starting work. But for many people, paying back credit card debt, that can be a significant hurdle to your long-term financial success. And I'll talk about that in a future episode. But the third option, if you don't have an emergency fund and you don't have the capacity to use debt to solve the problem, you might not be able to fix that problem. And depending on the situation that it is, that can be a significant factor in your life. So should you have one? I'm going to lean towards saying yes. So the best case scenario is having some cash on hand so that when these emergencies come up, you can pay it off right away and you don't need to worry about it. You've got the cash set aside, it's easy to access, and you can move on. Second best option is if you have access to a line of credit with a low interest rate. And when I say low interest rate, hopefully under about 6%, that would make it relatively doable. Using a credit card isn't a great option because the interest rates on credit cards are generally over 20%. If you need to go into debt, hopefully you're able to do it in an affordable way. So if we can start on the same page as saying you should have an emergency fund, how much should you have? Well, there's been a rule of thumb for a long time in the financial industry of 3 to 6 months of expenses. Not necessarily spending, because we spend money on things that aren't critical to our day-to-day needs. So when you calculate your emergency fund, using this rule of thumb, use 3 to 6 months expenses of things that you absolutely desperately need to pay for that month. So if an emergency happens, either you've lost your job and you can continue to pay those expenses, or it's likely enough money set aside. So if there's a large one-time expense, you've got enough saved to pay for that one-time cost. But is that a realistic amount to set aside? There's been a little bit more pushback in financial media recently of setting aside that much cash. One, because it's not really doable for a lot of people. And two, I'm going to get to this in a second again, but setting aside that much money every month puts a lot of your cash on the sidelines where it could be invested and making you more money than if it was just sitting in a savings account. So if that's the rule of thumb, but maybe it's not as applicable to today, what do you do? Well, Dave Ramsey, if you're familiar with him, he has always recommended that you at least start by saving $1,000. I've seen a number of studies in North America saying that most people wouldn't be able to financially withstand a one-time cost of $600. So if you have $1,000, you can get out of a quick jam if need be. But $1,000 doesn't buy you a water heater. It likely wouldn't pay for a significant surgery for your dog, things like that. And so if you start with $1,000 and build closer to that 3 months of expenses, you'll probably be in decent shape. So where do you want to keep that $1,000 or 3 to 6 months of expenses? Well, you could keep it in your checking account in theory, but if you're like most people, your checking account is for your day-to-day spending. So money goes in, money goes out. And most people, when they see money that's in, they think it's spendable money. I recommend that you use a savings account. I actually use a separate institution altogether than my day-to-day banking. So it's kind of out of sight, out of mind in the best way. So I'm not considering spending that money when I know that I need to save it for a potential problem down the road. So it's not really earning much money in that savings account. So some people would say, well, should I invest that money? Well, then it gets back to one of my earlier points where if you need to come up with some money in an emergency, you might be forced to redeem from your investments at a bad time. So when you thought you had 3 months of expenses and the market goes down, that might be only 2 months worth of expenses at that time. So I don't recommend investing your emergency fund. I'd say keep it in cash. Maybe use a GIC, but it's probably not worth it in case it's a non-cashable GIC. So I would recommend keeping your emergency fund in cash, preferably at a different institution, at the very least a different account than when you do your day-to-day banking. Are there downsides to having an emergency fund? Like I mentioned before, one of the latest trends is saying that's way too much money to have sitting on the sidelines, and most people can't afford to miss out on the gains of not having that money invested. And there's some merit to that for sure, because the likelihood of emergencies is low, but at the same time, you're more likely to get in trouble by not having cash readily available than you are from missing out on gains from a small portion of your overall savings. So in conclusion, should you have an emergency fund? I would say yes. If you don't have an emergency fund or don't want to have an emergency fund, at least if you have a low interest line of credit that you have access to, that would be the second best option that I would recommend. But I would recommend that you have an emergency fund in cash. Like I mentioned before, if you can't do the 3 months of expenses, start with $1,000. If the quicker you can get $1,000 set aside for emergencies, the better, because some is better than none. And then finally, what I would recommend you do if you've decided that having an emergency fund is appropriate for your situation, you should determine in advance what an emergency is for you and don't redeem from the account outside of those situations. So I would make a list of things that could happen that you would use to determine whether that is an emergency that you would need to access this money for. So things like a major home repair, major vehicle repair, being diagnosed with a critical illness, needing to spend time away from work for any reason, or a job loss in general. While it is cash savings, and because you haven't had an emergency for a few years, that doesn't mean that you should be using that money to go on the next trip to Hawaii or buy an iPad or the down payment on your next vehicle, things like that. So I would say to make the list of things that you've determined to be an emergency and then only redeem from the account when those situations arise. Okay, that was a quick look at emergency funds. We covered what they are, why you might need them, what happens if you don't have one, how much should you have, are there downsides to it, and the situations that you need to consider for when you'd actually use your emergency fund. Thanks for joining me today on the Canadian Money Roadmap podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd really appreciate if you left me a review on Apple Podcasts with your biggest takeaway. If you have questions or ideas for topics you'd like me to discuss on future episodes, please reach out via my contact info in the show notes. This podcast is intended to be educational in nature, and you should always consult your financial, tax, and legal advisors before making changes to your financial plan. Any rates of return discussed are historical or hypothetical and are to be used for educational purposes only. Evan Neufeld is a qualified associate financial planner and registered investment fund advisor. Mutual funds are provided through Sterling Mutuals Inc.